Have you ever heard of a genre-defining game? One that may not have been the original or first to do something in a genre, but the one that put it on the map, exemplified the characteristics and qualities that would go on to be the blueprint of what came after. Games like Doom, which made the modern template for FPSs, Final Fantasy and the continuous evolutions it brought to JRPGs, or in more recent years the Souls-like genre and the blueprint it carved out for modern action RPGs. You get the picture, and you probably get where I'm going with this, but Resident Evil would be the survival horror game that, whilst not the first survival horror game to exist, a lot of that would be contributed to a game like Alone in the Dark, would be the one to go on and heavily influence the genre, and define many of the hallmarks that would define what survival horror is in the context that we talk about it today. But Resident Evil Remake isn't just the genre-defining video game in terms of survival horror templates and blueprints, but it's also a gold standard for what a remake could and should be. It was a blueprint that would outline and define the gold rush that we are living in through the current generation, and it did it 20 years ago. There is something that is timeless and genius about Resident Evil 1 Remake, and today I want to deconstruct what it is that makes this game tick and why it's such a worthwhile video game 20 plus years later, the intricacies and genius that really went into making this the game that it is and a legendary survival horror experience. So without further delay, let's get into my video for Resident Evil Remake. The best place to kick off this video is with the development of Resident Evil Remake, the reason for its creation and what success it would go on to inspire. I want to kick this video off by talking about the 1996 version of Resident Evil, which was originally meant to be an FPS before Shinji Mikami was influenced by the Alone in the Dark series, which saw Resident Evil switch to the fixed camera angle perspective. As we all know, Resident Evil 1 would go on to popularize this concept, and there were two sequels that would release, both defining and pushing the genre further. Following the release of Resident Evil 3, there was a decision to develop what was the then Resident Evil 4, which would eventuate into what we now know today as Devil May Cry. These new projects would all be in the incubation phase, leaving Production Studio 4 without any real Resident Evil game to have. There was nothing for them in development. Meanwhile, studios largely unfamiliar with the franchise were working on games such as Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil Code Veronica for the Dreamcast. As an effort to fill this void, executive producer Shinji Mikami ordered the creation of two new Resident Evil games. One was what we would now see as the critically acclaimed Resident Evil 4, and the other would be a remake of the original 1996 classic, which Mikami would oversee as its producer. When development for Resident Evil 1 began in late 2000, there were concerns around how to develop a game for Nintendo's compact purple box, the GameCube. By early 2001, there were 4 developers learning both GameCube programming and computer graphics animation. The team size would fluctuate, but eventually it would expand. In the months that would follow, Hideki Motozuka focused on things such as blood squirting effects, and Shinji Mikami would participate in motion capture sessions for zombies. There were disagreements between Motozuka and Mikami over the excessive use of blood. It was late in 2001, and at this point the original was a one-to-one direct remake of the 1996 original. Mikami grew concerned that the game would be nothing more than a repackaged version of the same experience, just with some visuals that were the primary upgrade. Mikami insisted that changes be made to make the game feel new by adding new enemy designs and new areas. He wanted the game to feel like a new experience for those who had played the 1996 classic. But to me, it not only feels like that, but it feels like a fully realized version that they had for Resident Evil 1. Just, they now no longer had those limitations that they had back in 96. Naoki Katakai led pre-rendered backgrounds for the game. However, Katakai complied with Mikami's rule to focus on invoking fear rather than beauty with regards to the landscapes and backgrounds. Katakai was accused of being too slow to realize the intent of Mikami's vision. The approach of Resident Evil's art direction under Katakai aimed to be as realistic as possible, with the possibility of employing the absurd designs into the game if the realism became too boring. To achieve realism, Katakai would ensure developers incorporated particle effects to give the impression of dust in the air and create the distinction between the light quality and the different rooms. These stylistic differences were another cause for debate between Katakai and Mikami. This caused other members of the design team to wonder if the development of this remake would even pass its deadlines. These clashes wouldn't be for nothing, as Resident Evil would ultimately have a distinct atmosphere that would be largely attributed to the vision of both Katakai and Mikami. There would be a wealth of new inclusions to the game, like characters, locations, and overall lore that would expand upon the world of Resident Evil and tie future releases referencing things like William Birkin and from Resident Evil 2 along with Ada as well. Masaki Yamanaka was tasked by Mikami to find another enemy type to incorporate into the game, to which Yamanaka explored George Trevor, the architect of the Spencer Mansion, but rather than the enemy be George himself, have it revolve around a mother who wears human faces was the original idea, which then would ultimately wind up being his daughter, thus creating the Lisa Trevor character. Aside from Lisa Trevor, the cast revealed in Resident Evil HD consisted of established characters, so the design phase was to enchant their realism without removing what makes them recognizable. Instead of copying the likeness of famous people without their consent, a practice that could lead to many lawsuits, the team instead held auditions for body models. In the remake, the Neptune creature was largely expanded and redefined to the Aqua Ring, which made this section of the game new for fans. The remake for Resident Evil would launch to critical acclaim, with many critics and fans considering that it is the gold standard, the benchmark for what a remake could be, and would kick off the initiative for remaking Resident Evil games from the PS1 era and modernizing them. Many critics appreciated the gameplay enhancements and the added surprise for veterans, and the new changes kept veterans on guard when playing, something that at the time wasn't expected and wowed many who thought they would be in for an easy ride. Needless to say that to this day, Resident Evil Remake is still one of those defining games in not only the series, but the genre, and has easily stood the test of time. And with this remake now seeing many HD remasters for modern consoles, it is accessible and readily available to play. Don't just take the critics' words for it. I'm going to break down what makes this game so incredible, starting here. Let's get into it. Now I want to take it back to where it all began, the story, the STARS team journey into the Spencer Mansion, putting you, the player, in the shoes of both Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine. This revised version of Resident Evil's original story is mostly faithful to what played out in the 96 version, including a few new flourishes that are added on top. The STARS team, comprised of Barry, Wesker, Jill, and Chris, are set out to explore the expansive maze of the Spencer Mansion, and what they uncover is a ploy for a bioweapon and experiment conducted by the big pharma organization known as Umbrella. What unfolds after that is an outbreak and zombies haunting the halls, stalking Chris and Jill as they try to escape the mansion and uncover Umbrella's motives. Unlike later entries in the series, both playthroughs play out mostly the same for both Chris and Jill, but introduce new side characters that will assist you through your journey in the mansion. The changes in its narrative itself are minor, outside a few different dialogue moments that play out, but each playthrough does feel satisfying to experience based on the character and the scenarios that transpire. It's worthwhile getting to see all the interactions that Jill exchanges with Barry and Chris exchanges with Rebecca, even if in many ways these are just added flavour to more or less the same conclusion. But it does show a window into what type of scenarios and design work Capcom would later put into their future entries, and here in the remake, they have tried to add more individual moments for each character whilst keeping the story true and faithful to the original. One thing that really does set the remake apart from the 96 version is how the team there at Capcom's really just their commitment to overall realism, and it's evident from the get-go with that bleak opening cutscene that really just shows the hopeless situation that the STARS members have found themselves in. On top top of that, there is a change to the vocal performances that make many of these scenes and the delivery of the remake feel more serious rather than the goofiness that original is known for. What I think makes me fall in love with Resident Evil Remake's storytelling is the way in which it is delivered. This isn't just through the use of cutscenes, but the documents and the notes that you find as well. These little tidbits of information all accumulate to provide a vivid, clear picture that strings and threads all the events that have transpired in this mansion throughout the years, and slowly unfolds and reveals the bigger plot. And there is so many different little B-plot stories as well that you're reading about through these threads as well, and it all comes together really nicely, and the remake has a few additional stories that really have a great payoff as well. That being said, there are different endings as well that you can unlock in this game based on who you saved in pivotal moments and the outcomes of things that you chose to do in the final part of the game as well. There's a few things that you can see based on things you didn't do or did do, and I think that is new and a new addition here in the remake that I really appreciated. And overall, I think that this story is still very much iconic, and I think the remake gives it a new added touch, not just in a visual flair or modern cutscenes and things like this, but just in the way it approaches its overall atmosphere, delivery, and making this story feel serious rather than the silly kind of schlocky original that was released in '96. The combat for Resident Evil has seen refinements that provide the same tank controls of the original still available in this experience. Also, more modern and dynamic controls that allow for 360 movement. On top of this, the fixed camera angles of the original remain the same, preserving both the tension and atmosphere. There is also this inclusion of an auto-aim function when shooting enemies, something that was only present in the Japanese version of the original. In the remake, there is this new inclusion called defensive weapons. These include daggers, grenades, and tasers that are scattered across the map. These provide a last-ditch effort to players to get them out of a bind. They are this extra little bit of help, but they're also something that is finite as well, making you the choice of when you use them or getting caught out and using them, something that really is just milking a resource and giving you a little less second chances that you might have needed later on. The last new addition is a quick turn, which allows you to turn 180 degrees instantly. There are also many unique and unspoken little factors that play into Resident Evil's combat and traversal. Take for example, when running as Chris or Jill, if you are carrying your knife or no weapon opposed to holding a gun, you'll run faster, making it easy to get around enemies a lot quicker. There's a wealth of these little details just littered in this remake, like the walk cycles for these characters, for example. There are changes that have carried over from the original that are meant to create differences in difficulty, this being through Jill getting 8 inventory slots opposed to Chris's 6 slots, but Jill takes damage much quicker than Chris, and that's sort of a trade-off here. Now that we've discussed what's new to the combat experience, let's talk about how it still holds up. So Resident Evil 1's remake, the combat really does feel great. It feels like a blend of old and new. It has features that to this day still do feel modern and adaptable for most players. But most of all, the combat of Resident Evil 1 still feels tense, and the scarcity of ammo makes each shot you take truly feel like a tense, close quarters combat encounter, and it makes everything feel unreliable and in a good way, especially for first timers who will suck, like me, case in point. But for Resident Evil's combat, it feels like a mix of both knowing when and when not to engage, and there is many other factors such as the resource management and the problem solving that factor around the combat, making the game feel like a test of efficiency in when you choose to battle, when you choose to flee, and how you progress forward, knowing which ways to duck and weave around which zombies, which rooms to burn corpses of, and how to navigate this labyrinth of the Spencer Mansion. And it's like a puzzle piece. The more information you gather, the more easier it gets piecing these things together and really just navigating the halls of the mansion. And with that being said, I would like to talk about the puzzle design for Resident Evil, because Resident Evil is designed like a moving puzzle piece, where in the beginning you are lost with no information, blueprint, or sense of direction as to where to go. You'll pick up items in one room that won't show their purpose until much later in the game. There is a peculiar tick and click to the way Resident Evil throws you into its environment. It is like a mental note is made from each item acquired, and it in turn makes interacting with the environment and inspecting every object or item not feel like a chore, rather a sense of intrigue. It's the underlining beating heart of Resident Evil 1, and it's what makes this experience truly satisfying, and I believe something that really just hasn't been recaptivated since this game released. It's crazy because one of the things I've always praised the original Dark Souls for was its interconnectivity of its world. How many of the places you explore all intersect, interconnect, and provide shortcuts, hidden routes, and interlock with one another. Resident Evil is this precursor to this design philosophy. The Spencer Mansion is designed in such a meticulous manner where each item you pick up, be it ammo, health, or an item that is critical to solving a puzzle, they are all placed around each room with intent. On my first playthrough, exploring the mansion felt like navigating a labyrinth, one packed full of secrets, traps, and lore that only further etching the room layouts, enemy placements, and objects of interest into your memory. There was more than one time where I could have had that eureka moment inspecting an item from the item box and wanting to navigate and see if this clicks into place with some device I've found in a newly discovered area. It's this sense of intrigue that really just makes Resident Evil feel like this one-of-a-kind sense of place that not many games are able to capture. There are documents that provide insight into how to solve many of the different puzzles, but they are also cleverly built on the story, generally peeling back the onion of what took place in the mansion and its long history. On top of all of this, Resident Evil Remake feels like a completely new experience for veteran players, one that feels completely committed to the original vision that Mikami and co had back in 1996, but weren't able to fully create due to limitations. It is insane to consider just how far in the span of a few years one game that was once cutting edge would feel dated. This new remake would introduce new areas such as the graveyard outside, the courtyard for the residence area, and a wealth of new puzzles to accommodate these areas. The 4 masks for the first mansion section were a completely new addition, along with the new puzzles for who you acquire the keys for to unlock different parts of the mansion. There really isn't any other game than any other Resident Evil that hits for me quite like the way Resident Evil 1 did. Granted, I still do need to tick the original Resident Evil 2 off my list, but compared to its remake counterpart and even the more modern games like Resident Evil 7, which is fantastic, or even the Resident Evil 2 remake, there is something quite unique about Resident Evil 1's puzzle design and how effortlessly it blends together into this world building and further gets you invested. One thing I will say about Resident Evil 1's puzzles is, whilst many do have the writing on the wall in terms of the solution to solving them, there are one or two towards the later half of the game that do feel rather opaque in terms of what they're asking the player to accomplish. But overall, this game really just, its puzzles, the way it has you traverse its world, the system, the enemies, the placement, and everything that makes this mansion tick really does create a sense of atmosphere and place that I only think is rivaled by the police department in Resident Evil 2, and I don't think many other games in the series, despite how great they are, really have been able to match this original beauty. And now I want to talk about that last component that really does gel all these things together. I've touched on the enemies, but the enemy variety in Resident Evil Remake really is something that is incredible. The remake of Resident Evil sees the return of the iconic zombies that occupied the mansion, along with the hunters, but the inclusion of Crimson Heads was a new addition that came in the remake to add an added level of suspense to the overall experience of navigating the mansion. On top of that, it makes the tensity of re-exploring rooms where you've left a corpse for a period of time really feel like an unsuspecting surprise, especially when you don't know the mechanic or haven't seen Crimson Heads before and don't really know how they tick. It also makes encounters and your usage of gas feel more strategic. Which rooms will you be navigating through a lot? Which rooms is it optimal to clear out these corpses before they do turn into Crimson Heads, and which ones can you live with? The hunters also, compared to their 96 counterpart, are much more aggressive, being able to jump around with moves that can kill you almost instantly. It makes navigating the mansion feel a lot more threatening and makes you have to opt to take longer routes and avoid encountering hunters that lurk these halls when they appear in the game. There is even the possibility for different enemies to knock down doors, eliminating the safety of the door, which is supposed to seal away enemies between one room and another. And when enemies like hunters and these certain zombies are able to knock these down and stalk a room that was once protected and separating you and the enemy, it really does add a level of unpredictability and suspense to the way you navigate this mansion, and it evolves over time. The different enemy variety is on another level, and the element to this game that really just makes it an already great game and further excels it into something truly exceptional. And all of these elements together really do underpin that moment-to-moment gameplay loop that defines Resident Evil 1 as such an iconic and replayable and memorable experience. The inventory management here in Resident Evil 1 is where the system began, and it is something that is now so synonymous with the genre and almost inescapable. The remake has remained faithful to this vision of resource management, and it is the most direct and bare bones version of this system, and I love this game for it. Everything you pick up will hold a slot in your inventory, unlike later entries in the game, particularly the remakes and games like Resident Evil 4. The amount of inventory space that you have is also finite. There is no upgrades or expandable slots that you'll get as well. Another interesting component of Resident Evil 1 is the amount of inventory space that was given to each character, with Jill being given 8 inventory slots and Chris being given 6. This was supposed to be a design choice in the original 96 version of the game to reflect the level of difficulty between the two characters, and has been carried over here in the remake. Still, it isn't the sole determining factor of difficulty for the given characters that you choose to play as. There are subtle changes, such as Chris being more resilient to damage than Jill. Still, Jill has more inventory slots, and both characters have the inclusion of defense weapons here as well as a last-ditch effort to prevent taking damage that don't take up inventory space. These are nice fine additions that don't really mess with the original 96 foundations and formula of this inventory system, but add nice additions to help with things such as difficulty, and giving a helping hand here and there in particular situations. Overall, the bare bones nature of Resident Evil's inventory management works so well because it's interwoven with the terror and sense of survival that comes from exploring the mansion. It requires the player to have foresight, preparing items in advance for each adventure that they take out of a safe room, and to intentionally choose which major objective to focus on next without being able to hoard every key item that they find. The inclusion of the item box makes the save rooms feel like a haven from terror and a drop-off point for items of interest that you find, but currently don't have a use for. It plays into the labyrinth-like exploration, the backtracking, and the route scouting methods that I discussed earlier when talking about the overall atmosphere and gameplay loop of Resident Evil. There are many things that on an initial inspection of this game seem to serve no purpose or minimal function, which won't become apparent till much later on in the game, and resources are sparse and littered in a way that they are required to be used at a particular point in the game. The word survival in the survival horror genre feels the most literal in Resident Evil 1, and the game's exploration, problem solving, and overall usage of resources all intertwines into the game and makes it a game of knowledge that you slowly unravel as you play and get further and further into both of these characters' playthroughs and stories. One thing as someone who's mostly experienced Resident Evil through a more modern lens that I really appreciated about the original experience is how the survival elements are integrated into the game, making every decision feel like a choice and a puzzle piece. We have touched on resource management, but it becomes doubly apparent when you have resources like fuel and your lighter that allows you to burn corpses and prevent dead zombies from evolving into crimson heads that litter and roam a room. Evolved versions of these walking zombies that chase you and deal more damage makes a room that was once safe feel way more frightening. And I know that we've touched on this earlier, but I really do think it is a clever mechanic, and it is an interesting survival element that makes you have to factor in the way you traverse each area of the mansion and each section. Which place do you want to risk having to deal with crimson heads versus which ones are more vital that you'll be going to regularly that is worth burning the corpses for. This is a new addition to the remake, and it's genius as it makes a room once believed to be safe feel unpredictable. It makes you question how often you'll need that room and whether burning the corpse is worthwhile as an investment to provide safety when you return there later on. It's these kinds of decisions and choices that play into the puzzles, the inventory management, the way that you navigate different enemies, conserve your resources, and just get through this campaign in a way that makes this game feel like the most survival horror like Resident Evil that I've really played. Whilst I've enjoyed my time with the 2 through to 4 remakes and the more modern 7 and 8, I do think that there is something about this original design here that is just so fascinating to just pick apart and dissect. And I think that that's just overall attributed largely to this vibe, atmosphere, and underlining mechanics that glue Resident Evil 1 together, and more so its remake that makes it feel like this refined and fully realized version of what that 96 game was. And it is just to this day a game that holds up incredibly incredibly well. And with this in mind, I want to segue to the next part of this video, the mood and the atmosphere, because I do believe that these are the big icing on the cake, the cherry on top that solidify this game with all of its mechanical depth that we've discussed just now. It can't be stated enough how much the mood and atmosphere for a video game really drives the experience from good to masterful. And I feel that sentiment is doubly true for horror games. There is something so brilliant and masterful in the way Resident Evil sets its mood and tone and terrifying atmosphere right from the jump. It's simple yet effective. Techniques like flickering lighting, the groans of zombies down the hall, but also the way it beautifully shifts these moments of horror into moments of peace. The save room is notoriously known for its calming music, bright lighting, and the almost cozy feeling that it invokes. It feels weird to call a room in a horror game cozy, but it really is. It feels like a haven for the player. I think this is a handshake between fear and comfort that is ultimately something that makes Resident Evil 1's atmosphere and mood a work of genius. To this day, Resident Evil's remake has nailed the overall atmosphere of the Spencer Mansion. Whether it is the abandoned, decadent halls of the Spencer Mansion proper, the abandoned, decrepit residence, or the dingy biolab buried underneath the mansion, there is something that feels so haunting but oddly familiar and comforting on the sequential playthroughs of this game. The save rooms feel dingy and run down, but comforting and peaceful, not just because of the peace they provide, but because of the sense of lighting and comfort in the room, and the soundtrack backing it as well. The overall models and redesigns for the zombies are more detailed than their original counterparts, along with new enemies with interesting designs and variations. But the thing I think about Resident Evil 1's remake overall that is most impressive as a feat is how well it just has held up. I chalk that down to how nicely its backgrounds look and how well the models inhabiting them complement the world. This game has received a HD remaster for modern consoles to polish it further, but that style and look to me is timeless. Resident Evil 1's remake is still an absolutely incredible looking game to this day. It is unbelievable how much detail and atmosphere ooze from every room you explore. Each facet of the mansion has a peculiar mood it wants to invoke, whether it is scratch marks on the walls and run-down floorboards, or the elegant tiled floors with colourful geometric designs on the walls that showcase the elegance of the Spencer Mansion. Each key area feels uniquely distinct, and I think one major component that sells this overall mood and atmosphere. One major component that we discussed in the development section of the video is the approach the team took to lighting in the remake. If you look around in many different rooms, you'll notice how diverse the usage of lighting is in various spaces you visit in the game. Compared to the 96 original, the lighting here in the remake feels much dimmer, sparingly used, and the light sources themselves are deliberate, making the decor and the mood of the room feel more believable. The use of pre-rendered backgrounds is a factor that I believe truly enriches Resident Evil 1's atmosphere and overall design as something that is timeless. The use of pre-rendered backgrounds allowed for so much detail to be added to each room of the mansion in particular. The discussion came from the fact that Resident Evil 1's remake was going to have 3D backgrounds like Code Veronica and Dino Crisis. The technology and 3D assets the team were making at the time were so ahead of the time and technology that the team decided to change utilizing pre-rendered backgrounds to retain the high quality assets that had been created. What it ultimately achieves is the preservation and the feeling of mixed camera angles, which distinguish and create mood and tension, along with highly stylized, detailed environments that shift perspective with each camera change. To me, Resident Evil 1's remake is living proof that stylistic design, a cohesive vision for the mood, feeling, sense of atmosphere that you want to create in a game will always triumph higher fidelity, making a game truly timeless in how you play it, like how it holds up. Resident Evil 1 just looks so distinct and feels, there has a real sense of feeling, a soul when you play this game. You can really just get a sense of feeling in this world. And I think that is just something that is really chalked up to just the mood and atmosphere that this game creates. And the sound design for Resident Evil 1's remake is also another element that has aged quite well. The musical choices in the remake are fantastic, with some that immediately invoke a particular room's sense of feeling and activities, with some sounding more inquisitive, meaning that this room is a puzzle room. As I mentioned before, the save rooms are got this cozy feeling, meaning you can take a rest and feel at ease. And then there's themes that invoke tension when enemies are in the room. I immediately remember the theme that would play when entering the puzzle rooms as well. It is so iconic. I touched upon this earlier in the story section, but the voice performances in the remake are absolutely great too, and they still hold up to this day. And I think that they make the game's narrative feel a little less schlocky than the original one kind of came off, especially with the limitations that it had at the time. A lot of it was understandable, and I do think it has its charm, but I think to this day, having these voiced performances and things of this nature really does make this game feel more like a realized version of what they were going for with that original game. And I've said this multiple times, but it really does feel like this remake is them being able to soak every idea that they originally had for the original Resident Evil and bring it to life in this experience. And whether it's from their visual mood and atmosphere, the mechanics and inclusions that they put in this game, or the voice and vocal performances that have been included, it all has come together to make a long-lasting impression and a game that's so easy to return to that kind of in a weird way feels like home for many. So to bring this whole video together, Resident Evil is an incredible video game. The original still holds strong 30 years later, with its legacy and so many of the features and concepts that it's brought to the table for the survival horror genre, and it's still going strong 30 years later. But this remake really just shows all the enhancements that not only reshape the way that we perceive the original Resident Evil, but also are the gold standard that defined remakes going forward, and would be what set the remakes of the classic Resident Evil games into motion, even if we wouldn't see the next remake of a Resident Evil game until over a decade later. Before I played Resident Evil 1's remake, I thought to myself, why don't they just do a modern remake as they did with Resident Evil 2? You know, like the same type of structure, having the over-the-shoulder, all these modern controls. Why don't they just make it the same and do a remake for this game? Well, the answer is they did. And now, having finished the game multiple times, not only does this title in most respects hold up by modern standards, but I'd argue it's still one of the quintessential survival horror games you'd have to experience at least once if you love this genre. And I feel like I'm kicking myself that it's taken me this long to experience a game this great. There is something about the Spencer Mansion that calls you to explore all its mysteries, a synergy between environmental storytelling, the way the puzzles contextualize themselves, and also have narrative information tucked into them as well that gives you extra flavor to Resident Evil's narrative and make the discoveries in this story feel natural. The combat still has some intentional stiffness with even auto lock enabled, but all these encounters feel tense. The fixed camera angles, the act of putting distance between you and the enemy, and the scarce amount of resources. All of these things I've just mentioned, none of them are negatives. They are all strategic and they are all made with intent, and they make this game feel incredible. And traversing this intricate labyrinth has been an absolute delight, and it is in large part why I believe that this game is so easy to return to. It's a game that absolutely shocked and wowed me by delivering on the legacy it has held high for all of these years. And if you are a fan of the genre and you haven't played it, I absolutely recommend this one as a must-play video game, because Resident Evil 1's remake is a fantastic game and has just become one of my favorites in the genre right after finishing it, and still to this day I have not been able to get that game out of my head. So with all of that said, Resident Evil 1 Remake is a fantastic game that I believe doesn't need another remake, because it in of itself is something that is damn near close to perfect. Thanks for watching.